Hey YouTube, this is Ian from Big Rock ADV. So for 2020, the KTM 500 EXC, and actually all the KTM EXCs, their dual sport line, are all brand new. Now on first glance, you look at it compared to the older bikes and you might think, well, it kind of looks the same. What did they really change? Well, they actually changed almost everything. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So what we're going to do in this video is, number one, we're going to talk about what are the major changes on the 2020 bike versus the older models. And number two, I'm going to give you some first impressions of riding this bike around and talk to you more about some of the other content that I have planned for the bike. So let's go ahead and get started. So if you look at the history of the EXC line, KTM has really used this bike over the years, and it's become more of an evolution than a revolution, if that makes any sense. So if you look back, you know, you had the RFS bikes in the 2000s, those went up to 2008, and then you had the 2008 to 2011 bike, which I think that was called maybe the XC4 engine, I'm not sure, I can't remember. And then in 2012 they went to the fuel-injected bikes, and the first run of the fuel-injected bikes, the first gen of that was 12 to 16, and then 17 to 19 was the second gen fuel-injected bikes, which were redesigned. And then for 2020, which is this bike, they've redone it all again. KTM is a company that's very committed to making what may seem like small improvements, but because they're so focused on racing and the motorsports part of it, those small improvements actually really matter to their riders. And the great benefit for us as average guys who buy these bikes is we get to benefit from all the stuff that the racers are telling KTM to put on the bike. God, this thing's light. So like I said, this bike is almost all new for 2020. There's not too much that carries over. I mean, maybe small things like the fenders and the blinkers and, you know, maybe the instrument cluster, some of the switch gear, the minor stuff like that. But the bodywork is new, the fuel tank is new, the exhaust is new, the engine's new, the frame is new. So let's break this down. What's important? What do you care about? So number one, it's an all new engine. Now, it kind of looks the same as the old one, right, on the 17 and 19s, but no, it's different. Some of the big changes with the engine are, so the compression ratio has gone up a whole point, and I'll put the statistics down here in the video, but they've increased the compression a whole point. It's still able to run, obviously, on 91 pump gas, but you do need to be cognizant that, you know, put 91 octane in it, put premium in it, because at this high of a compression, it's really important. The additional compression is allowing them to get a little bit more power out of it. The piston and the cylinder are new, so I know they're new, they're lighter weight. I'll put up some photos here from KTM, so they've done that. The engine cases are thicker in the places where it matters. What I've read is that these are thicker, so more prone to, less prone to having a crack there, but I've bought some covers for it, which will be a later video. So they made the engine lighter, they made it more powerful. So another thing, if talking about the engine and getting into the fueling, they've added the O2 sensor here, which you know, you could debate whether that's a good thing or not, but what it does is it allows the computer in the bike to adjust for different elevations, different air densities, and adjust the amount of fuel the bike's getting. So we'll talk about that when I talk about the first impressions ride. So I've tried to find some dyno charts and some power figures for this bike. It's kind of hard with dirt bikes. One, I think because dynos are so different at different places, and there's a lot of kind of sketchy information out there on different dynos and things, so be careful with that. But what I've been able to figure out, and I really looked at this, is that the 2020, for the 500 at least, the 2020 seems to make about 5 or 6 horsepower more. So around a 10% or so increase in power bone stock. That's a big deal, and it's something you'll feel. Okay, so we've talked about the engine and how that's new. I mentioned the exhaust is new as well. They still have the restriction in the exhaust, and I probably do plan to cut out this end screen. But, you know, we'll get to power mods in another video because I'm not sure I'm going to do all the power mods. I haven't decided yet. But let's talk about the frame. So what they did is they took the frame from the motocross bike, I guess from last year or the previous couple years, and put it in the dual sport bike. So you've got the stiffer, lighter, lower weight frame. The other thing to notice about this bike, when you sit on it compared to the 2017 to 19, and this is a little subtle, but when you sit in it, you notice everything's kind of lower. The fuel tank, the radiator, everything's kind of lower in the front. They've pushed the mass down a little bit. I think combined with a stiffer frame, this bike is going to handle quite a bit better than its predecessor. Let's talk about suspension. That's really important, right? So it still is under the WP Explorer name. You've got the PDS rear shock, which KTM is famous for. I love PDS for trail riding, but that's just me. For the front, you've got the WP Explorer fork. Now, what they have done for 2020 is they've revised the valving. They've actually added, I think, what they call like a mid-stroke piston or a mid-stroke valve, another valve in there that better controls the suspension in the mid-stroke. For the rear shock, it's still a good high quality rear shock, but they've added another piston to the rear shock for better control and valving. We'll talk about more of my initial impressions later, but I do notice the suspension being a lot better than the older bikes, and the older bikes were already really good, so that's saying something. So going back to the frame for the second, the subframe is actually 40 millimeters longer on this bike. The bike has an all-new airbox design. I showed in my kind of unboxing video how they've changed that design a little bit, so that's good. It has a lithium-ion battery, and I don't know if that's different from the 2019s, but if you own a 2019, put it down in the comments whether it had a lithium battery or not. But by going to the lithium-ion battery, they're saving a lot of weight. The one downside to that is it's a very low-power lithium-ion battery. Now, granted, the bike doesn't have a lot of power demands, but I saw another video out there of someone complaining that the battery was too small of an amp hour capacity, so they were going to upgrade that. I'm not sure. I haven't looked into that yet for me, but we'll see how that goes. So I mentioned in one of my other videos, the exhaust is now a two-piece header. You can take it off here, which is nice for servicing various things. Someone on the other video said you don't have to take this off to remove the shock, which is good to know. But other items that may be aided by removing that, so that's easier to do. Okay, so still on my break-in ride, a few things I already noticed about this versus my 2014. It's smoother and quieter from the factory for sure. The low-end fueling is better, like it has more torque down low. It's quieter, it's a bit more refined. The vibration is less. And let's see what else. Yeah, it just feels like a more refined machine, which is awesome, which is a nice thing on a bike like this. The gearing, the gearing feels pretty good to me for dual sporting. Like, it's comfortable at 60, 65, but you wouldn't want to cruise much above 65, maybe 70 on it. But the gearing seems low enough for most trail use, except for you hardcore guys. But anyway, I'm going to continue to kind of break this in. You notice on the break-in ride, what I like to do is kind of vary the RPM. I like to give the engine some load. I don't want to go crazy with the RPM. I don't want to take it to red line. In the manual, it says don't go over 7,000 RPM, but obviously there's no tachometer, so you just kind of have to wing it and guess. Just don't go crazy with RPM. And then I'm going to change the oil. KTM calls for an oil change at 50 miles. So we're going to be doing that here real soon. So that's what we're going to bring you. So I'm on like my second ride with the bike. It's probably got 30 or 40 miles on it now. Just got to put 50 miles on before I do the first oil change. And a few things I'm already noticing about it versus the older EXC, which I had, which was a 2014. They've definitely worked on the suspension. Now, my 14 model didn't even have the Explorer fork. It had an older version, but the Explorer fork came out for the 17 to 19 bikes, and then for 20 they've revalved it, and I guess it has a new mid-stroke valve or something like that. But it feels incredible to me. Now, I'm not a pro off-road rider, pro motocross rider or anything, but it feels leaps and bounds ahead of my 2014 EXC, and it feels leagues ahead of my 690 that I had. So great job KTM with that. Another thing, the looks are really growing on me of the 6 days version. I'm kind of sad to be taking off the plastic. So I don't know, the kind of the black and the white and some of the other colors kind of growing on me, but that's a minor thing. I'm going to be turning the bike black and orange. But it is one sweet looking machine, I have to say. I love how this pipe looks. Man, it's just the little details on the KTM are just so nice. I don't know, man, it's just kind of beautiful. Anyway, I'm loving the bike. The seat is not as uncomfortable as I remember the stock seats being on these, but it's still, I've already ordered a Seat Concepts XL for it. Let's see, what else have I noticed? Yeah, the stock TKC 80s definitely are going to have to go. They just don't have the grip that this bike deserves. So in terms of the engine power and everything, I feel like it does, you kind of sense that it is plugged up maybe, either through exhaust or intake or something, or fueling, but it's actually faster than you think. It just doesn't feel as fast as it is. Like you look down and you're accelerating really fast, but it's more refined, it has less vibration, and it's quieter. That's the thing about this thing. This is quieter than the old EXCs. They've taken some of the rattling out of it, some of the lack of refinement that the other ones had, and it's smoother and quieter, so you don't notice how fast you're going. The other thing that they've improved on this new EXC is the low-end fueling and how it feels at like low RPM. So let's say you're in a gear too high, like you're in third when you should be in second, you can get away with it on this now. The old bikes, I felt like they kind of chugged and they didn't really like that. But whatever they've done, maybe it's partly to do with the oxygen sensor or just how they've tuned everything. It's pretty good for a stock bike, and it doesn't seem to run quite as hot as the old ones did. And again, this bike is completely stock. So really good job on that, KTM. So I'll share more impressions later, and I'm going to start working on the bike, but man, I'm just so impressed. I mean, the EXC has always been an impressive bike. Let's just admit it. It has. It's always been kind of the king of the dual sports, and it's just like riding a high-powered mountain bike. I mean, I have no hesitation to just start going down single track, whatever I see. It's just so much fun. I'm so glad I'm back on a 500 after having larger bikes for a few years now. Another thing I noticed is that the handling is definitely sharper. It turns better on single track. It feels much more nimble than my 2014 did. A huge thing is the fueling. This thing runs so well right off the bottom, which is a big change from the older EXCs. You know, I remember my older ones, they didn't really like to be lugged down. If you were a gear too high, it would tell you. With this one, you can get away with kind of lugging it in second or third gear when you should be a gear lower, and it doesn't really care. The fueling is really, really good down low. So I guess my caution to you is if you're going to go and start changing things, exhaust, or you're going to pull the reeds out of the intake, or you're going to do tuning, just be really careful with what you're doing, because everything affects everything else. So if you're going to change it, just know what you're doing and do your research, and don't believe some of the hype you read out there. The other thing is, do you need more power? Well, are you using all the throttle of the bike and not going fast enough? If so, then okay, then put power mods on it. But if not, if that's not happening, then you have to ask yourself why you're searching for more power. Is it just because you want the bragging rights to have the fastest bike? Or maybe it's just fun. And you know, I get that. It's awesome to have a really fast feeling bike, and that's great. But for me, I'm undecided yet on what kind of power mods I'm gonna do. I'm probably for sure gonna, today, cut the screen out of the back of this exhaust pipe, because it just retains too much heat into the exhaust. I did the same thing on my 2014, but the stock pipe is extremely good quality. In terms of fuel tuning and things like that, I don't know. So when you add all this up, you do have a whole new bike. Now, the changes are incremental, and like I said, they're more of an evolution than a revolution, but a new frame, lower center of gravity, a new, more powerful, smoother engine, and it is smoother, by the way, and I'll talk about that. A revised suspension, which was already great, but now is even better. You know, it's kind of a compelling package for me. I think a lot of you are wondering, you know, whether you should upgrade your older KTM to a 2020. I guess here's what I would say about that. If you have a really old EXC, like an RFS or one of the XC4 bikes from 08 to 11, and you haven't upgraded yet, if you're going to upgrade, just go right to the 20. I would just skip over the 2012 through 2019 bikes, in my opinion, because why don't you just buy the latest and greatest, and then in 5 or 6 years, you're still going to be happy with this, versus if you buy like, you know, a first or second gen fuel injected EXC, you're going to be thinking, well, I didn't really get the latest one. You might want to upgrade like a year from now. My experience, it's going to be cheaper for you just to get the 2020 and just ride it until you just wear the thing out. Now, if you own like a 2012, 2019 bike, so there's 2 generations in there of EFI. I owned a 2014 for a few years, which I loved. Comparing this bike to that, I immediately noticed how much better this bike is. It's probably not enough for me that if I had a well set up first gen EFI that I would sell it to get this. I probably wouldn't, but if my first gen EFI bike was worn out and just sort of really needed replacing, I would sell it and I would get the 2020. I'd skip the second gen EFI, the 17 to 19. Not that anything was wrong with them, but you're not going to pay much more, honestly, to get a brand new one. At least where I live, the values for used bikes like this are so high, like $8,000 or $9,000, that you might as well just buy a new one for 10 or 11 and then be able to treat it exactly how you want and from day one. So just my 2 cents.